I Barely Got Here is a collection of stories and conversations based on 24 years in law enforcement. You have the right to be disturbed by some of the content or disagree with the viewpoints. Anything you hear can and will be dosed with sarcasm and dark humor. You have the right to know the discussions will often be graphic with language and themes that are intended for a mature audience. Do you understand your rights? Then buckle up, Buttercup. We're going 10-8. Hello and welcome back to I Barely Got Here. I'm your host, Kevin Booncher. Tonight's episode, Where's Bosnia? So for the next couple episodes, I'm going to talk about some work I did in the country of Bosnia-Herzegovina. To do this, I took a leave of absence for a year from the police department, so I remained as a employed police officer, and then after that year, I went back to work for the police department. And I'll explain it further how it unfolded and then later some highlights or lowlights over the next episode or two. So I was working in Special Investigations Bureau as a detective when this started. I'd been in there for about 4 years at that point, and at that time, an assignment on the squad I was on was capped at 5 years. So I knew that I was pretty much on the short list. And if you run your assignment time out, then you would just go back to patrol as a uniform officer, and then you would shift bid by seniority accordingly during the regular shift bid schedule. Another option was you could work toward promoting, which for me would be to sergeant, but I wasn't ready for that yet. And then the third option was to start looking at other opportunities to go to another special assignment or a different work group, division, etc. Well, I loved what I was doing. The guys I worked with, my boss, the work that we did, just about everything was going as good as it was ever going to get. So there just wasn't anything else that interested me. And as I said, I wasn't ready to promote yet. My goal was to try to do that around that 10 or 12 year mark in my career. And at that point, I was only up to about 7 years on the department. You know, I was working undercover and doing these cool investigations and driving my UC take-home car. I was serving search warrants. We were chasing fugitives, going to SWAT call-outs, working, again, these really cool, large-scale. We were doing dope and gambling investigations, just all kinds of cool stuff, stolen vehicles. I was training other officers. And, you know, all the while I'm gaining just invaluable experience, training, and skills as I mature as a police officer. So I'd kind of resigned myself that I'd just rotate back to patrol that coming July as nothing else really appealed to me. Well, around March of that year that I was scheduled to go back to patrol, which was June or July, my sergeant happens to read something in a law enforcement magazine about a job offering. There was a program started by the United Nations and, of course, heavily subsidized by the United States to bring police officers and supervisors from various countries around the world to the country of Bosnia-Herzegovina, or Herzegovina, I'm not sure how to say it, but we'll go with Bosnia, for a law enforcement-based training program. And it was called IPTF, or the International Police Task Force Mission in Bosnia. Well, back then, around 96, prior to 96, Bosnia had just been devastated by a civil war, essentially, I guess you'd say, where three factions, the Croatians, the Bosniaks, and the Serbians, had all fought over control of various portions of the country. And I'm not going to go into detail of the war and the causes and who's right or wrong, blah, 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 but suffice it to say that it was very destructive, and there were just horrible war crimes committed on all those sides, and the war had officially ended maybe 6 months prior to this job announcement. So regardless of the situation and the war, I would describe Bosnia and the surrounding countries back then as not being very democratic or really free. So as it relates to the story, that means that law enforcement was militaristic with little oversight, way too many cops, and in desperate need of reform. So the goal of the UN program was to bring cops from democratic and free nations to their country and show the police how things should be done, weed out bad apples, and then trade up the ones that stayed. The actual mission goals were stated as integrate with the local government and police, observe and determine problem personnel, watch for and report human rights violations, cooperate with other UN organizations, and then teach and instruct. And it's a great idea, but, after I explain a few of these things, you'll see it didn't play out so well. Well, as I said, my sergeant, the same sergeant as from the eyeball episode, he reads this and brings it out to the squad while we're in the office. I think we were eating lunch. Well, he was thinking about doing it, and so we were all just kind of chatting about it. And based on that, I decided, well, hey, I'm interested in that as well. Well, the very first question was if I could get a leave of absence from the police department, because if not, then it's for sure no-go, not going to do it, because I wasn't going to leave that career for anything. And I didn't want to go through the whole rehiring process either to, basically quit, do the mission, and then come back and rehire. Huge hassle, and it's not a guarantee. So I checked into that, and I learned that it was available, and as long as the proper channels and the chain of command and all those things were involved, and then the chief ultimately approved it, it was possible. Well, there's another guy at our department who ended up going on the mission maybe a little before me, but basically the same time as I did. But he already had his 20 in, so he retired to go on the mission. So it was kind of a different set of circumstances. And it was kind of a drag because I only got to see the guy once during that whole year just due to logistics. And then Ray, my sergeant, he didn't end up pursuing the job, but as I'll explain, he was really supportive of my effort and very integral in helping me be able to go. Well, the requirements for this job is set down by the State Department for the U.S., who ran the program basically from our side. You had to have at least 8 years experience as a cop. You have to have some training experience. You have to have the ability to go out of country for the year. You have to be in good health, and there's a few other things. But after I got in country, about a month later or so, I learned that all those requirements are really more like guidelines, maybe suggestions, once I got a look at some of the folks that I was working with for the year. And the only requirement that I didn't meet was the tenure. Like I said, the civilian contractor for the State Department, called DynCorp, who handled the hiring and the vetting and all that, they kind of waved that off, and then I was one step closer to going. And the process as it pertained to work was fairly straightforward. I wrote my memo to my sergeant, told him what I wanted to do, why, how it could benefit the department, the impact of my work group, et cetera, et cetera. And then he attaches his cover memo on why he supports it, which in reality is more important than my memo to begin with. So then this gets forwarded up the chain of command, ultimately to the chief's office for his final approval or denial. Well, my chief approved the leave of absence and was supportive of the mission, as were most of the others involved in the process for the PD. So that part of the process was fairly painless, and I appreciated them all giving me that opportunity to go. And from the personal side, it wasn't much harder. I was single at the time, no wife or kids that I needed to worry about leaving. I don't think I would have done it if I'd have been married with kids. Maybe if I was just married, but who knows? I was living in my townhouse, and a good friend of mine, Chris, the same Chris from the Pajama Pants episode, was living with me at the time. Well, he wasn't going anywhere, so he agreed that he'd stay there, we'd rent out my room, and then he'd pay his rent and he'd take care of everything that had to do with whoever rented my room. So again, check that one off easy. And the girl that we rented my room to, named Jody, was also an employee with the same police department that I worked at, and she's a super nice gal, so that made it even better. The only downside was that on occasion they'd send me these pictures of how she'd girlified my room with her girl stuff, but of course I got over that and that was no big deal. And now I get back at Jody because when the issue comes up at a party or a little gathering or whatever, I'm always quick to tell them how Jody and I lived in the same room together. Of course, leaving out the at different times part. I had a truck at the time. There's no reason or need to keep that, so I put that up for sale and sold it in, a week or so. My plan on my return was to buy a new truck anyway. Well, I did have my street bike, which I loved, so another friend of mine, Bob, would be the same Bob who yelled at the blind guy in episode 27, agreed to store it for me at his house while I was gone. So there's another thing checked off. I lined up my parents to receive the portions of my paycheck that would be sent home versus given to me in country, so that's set up, check. Everything was coming together pretty well, which is good because from the time that I decided to go on the mission to the time that I actually left, turned out to be only about 4 weeks. So why'd I want to go? Well, first and foremost, it was an adventure. I mean, it's something that would probably be, and so far has, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, given my position in life and where I see myself going. And as I said, I was in a place where the logistics were fairly easy to work out. Within days of learning about the opportunity, I went out with a few of my good friends, and because I wanted to bounce the idea off of them. And I'll never forget the one thing that Bill said to me. Never mind that 2 weeks later he got us both arrested at the Mexican border, but that's another story. So that night, after I'd explained the whole thing to him, Bill says, "Boonch, if you don't do it, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what it would have been like, so you got to go." And that night marked that point that I decided I was going to pursue it and go. So why else did I want to go? Well, the pay. The pay was really good, considering what I was making at that time and what the contract paid. But the real kicker was that per, U.S. tax law, if you work out of country for 335 out of the 365 consecutive days, or close to that, you don't pay tax on your income, which is huge. Now, there were guys that went home for various amounts of time while we were over there, but I knew that if I went, I was going to explore Europe and do as much as I could over there, so the 335-day thing was easy for me. I didn't go home at all. So you couple a high salary with no taxes and then having my great job to return to, and I mean, it was a big move for me financially. And last, I did believe in the concept of the mission, and I wanted to do what I could to help. I really thought that I could make a difference, similar to how you think of as being a cop. For those first few weeks that I was still home, I was researching the country and the mission and the UN and just anything I could find, as I knew nothing about Bosnia prior to this job opportunity coming up. There's a gal I was dating at the time bought me a book on Bosnia that I actually took with me too, and I still have it. It was a thoughtful gift, and it came in really handy. The biggest concern that I had with the mission was it was designated as an unarmed, meaning we would not be carrying or using firearms in any way, which that's kind of unnerving to someone like us being the cops coming from America. But once I got in country, I realized that it was probably better for us that we weren't armed. I would have been much more concerned about getting shot by another monitor, as that's what our titles were, than any of the locals or the local police or anything else. So after a very short 4 weeks or so and a few really fine send-off celebrations with friends and family, I was off to New York City for a few days of pre-mission prep, equipment issue, and orientation and stuff like that. Well, I'd never been to New York, so that was kind of a cool way to start the process. And the first morning we got started, we were getting info on what we'd need, what was going to happen, lots of paperwork, getting uniforms and gear issued. And I remember thinking they sure are giving me a lot of cold weather gear, which is definitely not something I would use much in Phoenix, but man, did I use it in Bosnia. And during the couple of days of activity, I met a couple of guys that I ended up being around the rest of the year, Mike and Kevin. And they were both like me. They'd taken a leave of absence to go on the mission. Neither one had retired. Well, Mike was a New York cop, so we were in his hometown. He's what I'd imagine for a New York cop. He's big and loud, but a really nice guy once you got to know him. And he'd get really animated when he talked, and his gestures and talking loud and cursing like a sailor. And this was the first time I heard the term mopes. He's calling people mopes all the time, which is, like me calling you a jerk, I guess, or a goof. So it's kind of funny. And I think he may have saved Kevin and I the second night, as we'd rented a car and we were going to go and check out the city. That day after training, Mike says, "Hey, what are you guys going to go do?" And we says, "Hey, we rented this car and we're going to go out cruising around, check out the city and just kind of see what we can see." And so Mike, in typical New York fashion, he's like, "What are you, effing crazy? You can't just drive around. You're going to get yourselves killed before we even go overseas." So he explained to us that unless you knew exactly where you were going in New York City, you could easily wander into the wrong places and find yourself getting carjacked or robbed or worse. So he pulls out a map that we had and he starts to point at various areas that were around the hotel we're staying. It reminded me of a really old Dennis Leary stand-up routine where he would point out like good block, crack block. This is the robbery block. This is the hooker block, and so forth. So anyway, change of plans, and we ended up going out with Mike that night to a bar that's frequented by the NYPD. I honestly think that they and their families were the only ones in there. And then we met up with a bunch of his friends and just had a great time. I don't think we paid for any food or a single drink that night. And then Kevin was an Illinois State Trooper and an aspiring stand-up comedian. He still has a really deep, kind of monotone voice that lended itself to his comedic delivery. Well, he also had the proclivity to see the negative in many situations, leaning toward humor, of course. That's a long flight across the Atlantic. Plenty of time to go down like a lawn dart, is one of the first that I remembered. Well, within days of the three of us meeting, between Kevin's voice and reminding us of the bad in most situations, he ended up with two nicknames, Eeyore, from like Winnie the Pooh, and Mr. Happy. Well, Mr. Happy endured into Bosnia, and during the coming year, many of the third world guys who didn't speak much English knew Kevin better as Mr. Happy than his actual name. And Kev was easygoing. He didn't get too wound up about things, and he and I would later take some pretty fun and cool CTOs, or the compensatory time off, over that year of work. Well, we made that flight from New York across the Atlantic, no lawn dart, and landed in Zagreb, Croatia, our last stop before going into Bosnia. We were there for about a week for additional training that was hosted by the UN and geared toward our stay in Bosnia. Most important of anything was the training on landmines and similar explosives. Because with the constantly shifting lines during the war, there were landmines planted just all over the place in the country, like even in the middle of what you would think would be nowhere. So they drilled into us, never step off the hard pack, being concrete or asphalt. And every so often later, when we were in country, you'd hear boom. And after you check into it, it'd turn out to be some poor cow or a fallen tree or a piece of building that collapsed and triggered the mine. Well, no people were seriously hurt while I was in our area for that year, thankfully. And then once we'd been there for a short time, we'd check with the military units nearby, and they would declare a certain dirt road or roads as cleared because they needed to drive on them. So we'd mark that and we'd trust that, but you'd still avoid walking on the dirt if it was at all possible. That's one of the only things I remember well from that training week, and it stuck. Matter of fact, it took months for me to get over it once I got home. I'd seen more than a couple dead, bloated cows off to the side of the road, let alone hearing about people catching one during that year away, so it's kind of ingrained. Other than the landmine training, the only other thing I remember much of is the orientation and training. For the Americans and probably the Germans and the French, this was basically wasted time, as anyone there had either you owned one or you used one at work, but bottom line was you're familiar with how they worked. But this being a multinational mission, there were guys there from other countries who'd never even seen a computer, let alone, touched one. In fact, there were guys there who'd never ridden in a motorized vehicle. So for most of that training, we just sit and watch these guys marveling at this magic box and screen. It was good entertainment. Now, I didn't see this firsthand, but I took it as valid considering a few things. During a break, a few of us were chatting, and one of the instructors came over, and he was an American also, and we were chit-chatting about different things. He was answering questions and giving us advice, etc., when we kind of shifted the conversation to the computers and how some of these guys had never seen one before. And he kind of laughed and told us that, there'd been this guy from Nepal who sat through the first part of a training, different class. Well, the class takes a break, and when the instructor returns, he finds this guy literally prying on the hard drive of the computer, like breaking it apart. So he yells at this guy, "Hey, quit, what the hell are you doing?" And the guy tells him in his broken English that he just has to see the little men inside the box that make it work. So we called BS on the story, but he swore to it up and down, and we actually heard it from another guy or two, so I'm pretty confident it occurred. Well, the instructor says, "Hey, you need to get used to stuff like that," and he was right. Well, part of the international requirements for this mission were that you had to have a working knowledge of English. Speak it, understand it, read it, write it. Depending on the location on the globe, other United Nations missions are designated as, English speaking or German speaking or French or whatever. But many of these guys that were there could barely get by. They're basically illiterate in English. So communication, or lack of it, along with many of them coming from third world countries and all that goes with that, became the norm for that next year. When it came to many of the participating countries, your rank and who you knew was much more a factor in your getting to go to Bosnia than meeting the requirements. We later learned that a guy from one of these third world countries where wages were really low earned the same rate as we did, which seemed fair. But the discrepancy was so great that a guy from, say, Pakistan could go on this year-long mission to Bosnia and make the same as working in his country for 15 or 20 years. So it was very competitive and very common for positions to be granted based on favoritism, rank, and bribery. And it was so common that later, when one of my jobs is I would go pick up the pay for our whole station in this other town, I would watch as these guys would collect their pay in this envelope, and then they would turn and walk over to this other guy who would be their ranking guy for the country and basically hand them the kickback right out of the envelope of cash. It's just hard to believe, but I saw it. Well, we got through that first week of training and learned where we were going to be assigned in country. Mike and I ended up getting assigned to the same town, a place called Yaitse. My friend Kevin was assigned to a town not too far from us, Bogojno, so we were all pretty happy with how everything shook out. Well, a truck was sent for Mike and I, and we loaded in for, I think it was like a 6 or 7 hour drive. The driver was an American from our station. He was from Texas. His name was Scott. He's a big guy, real nice guy, almost too nice, we used to tell him. He had this habit of waving to anyone passing by in another car by. You kind of flick your fingers up off the steering wheel, and he did that to everybody, which I later found out was confusing to my Nepalese friend Gon, who I also met for the first time during this pickup. Well, Gon, despite his small stature, had a big personality and turned into one of my favorite people of the mission. He was there with 2 other Nepalese guys, neither of who could hardly speak a lick English, so Gon took care of most of their communications. We learned that we were going to be put up in a town away from Yaitse for the short term, Bogojno, in fact, where Kevin was stationed, as there weren't any living accommodations available for us in our town yet. Yaitse had been blown and shot up so badly that they were still trying to get buildings somewhat livable, and that was just for the few residents who were trying to return. Even our station didn't have an actual building or office yet for the same reason, but they were working on that when we first got there, and eventually we had a place to go. To give you an idea, pre-war, the population of Yaitse and all its surrounding little villages and towns was about 42,000. And then when I arrived in Yaitse for that mission in 96, there were only about 10,000 people. There are a number of police and military checkpoints on that initial drive down, which is just so weird and foreign for an American, but the country was beautiful. And as we chatted away about hometowns and expectations, you'd notice all the destruction to the buildings and the roads and the bridges, be a blown up tank off the side of the road here and there. Just about anything standing had at least a bullet hole or two, more likely had hundreds of bullet holes and maybe a hole blown into a wall. Well, we arrived in Bogojno, which is about 45 minutes or an hour from Yaitse. And we actually drove through Yaitse on the way there, so we were able to stop for a little bit and see some things and meet a couple of the guys we'd be working with. We met the station commander, Jim, who is from New York, so Mike was loving that. He's a character, and his accommodation or his flat, or I'd call it an apartment, did double duty as the IPTF station office for Yaitse at that time. So that first month in country, there were many a workday that kind of morphed into a nighttime drinking jag for a few of those monitors. As I said earlier, we are all called monitors at the beginning of this mission there. I guess monitor, you watch, you observe. Maybe it makes sense. And that went for everybody that was participating in the mission. Well, as things developed, you could end up being a station commander or a liaison or an MTO, which is the guy who took care of the vehicles and facilities, or there's a couple other jobs. And many other guys there just wanted to do as little as possible, so they're happy with just being a basic monitor the whole time. The one thing that did change fairly soon for the Americans were our general titles. So example being that I went over, I was a detective. I was a police detective. There were guys over there from other countries, though, mostly third world, who were complaining about being given direction or orders by someone of a lesser rank than they were. Never mind that they could barely speak English, couldn't drive a car, came from, quite honestly, oppressive police nations, and thought little men were inside computers making them work. But nonetheless, it was given consideration and brought to the attention of the American delegate. So they came up with a solution. We're just going to promote every single American in the mission to the rank of captain. It was beautiful. I mean, one day you're just a lowly officer, detective, whatever, and the next day your title officially changed to captain. Well, we all got a laugh out of the silliness of it all, but it seemed to work, again, as ridiculous as that sounds. We made a show of it for a while, calling each other captain and saluting all the time. The guys from Germany and France, those guys got it and laughed along with us, thought it was pretty funny. The guys from most of the other countries, not so much. They kind of thought that we should be more appreciative of getting the promotion because we'd earned it so much. Which brings up a similar issue. So, in the interest of fairness, there is a policy within the UN, I'm sure it's still there, called national balance. And what that means is that positions of authority, assignments, etc. are given out not so much due to competence or ability or somebody deserving the position, but most importantly with regard to a variety, or I should say most importantly with regard to maintaining a variety of nationalities. So if we had a station commander that was Egyptian, the entire station couldn't be run or supervised by all Egyptian monitors. And likewise, and closer to the true cause of this policy, you couldn't have a station run completely by Americans or Germans or French. And this could be a real challenge depending on the nationalities that you had within your station. We always did our best to abide by the policy, but kind of hard given the quality of the pool, you know. And in the end, the real work was done by those of us who could do it, regardless of title, rank, or nationality. Anyway, Mike and I get down to Bogoino, and we're taken to a small house where he and I will live for the next couple of weeks or so. We share the same bedroom, not much in the way of an alternative. Accommodations in Bosnia were pretty cheap, with the exception of some of the stuff that was in Sarajevo, and I never paid much for a place during my year there, even for the nicer place that I lived in later. We meet the owner of the house that we're going to be staying in, who is just this enormous German-Croatian guy. I just can't remember his name now. I do remember thinking he's probably in his 60s, and he had some of the biggest hands I'd ever seen in my life, just these gigantic palms and these huge sausage fat fingers. And man, could that dude drink. I'm not talking about some beer or wine. I'm talking about some sort of homemade turpentine Everclear moonshine concoction that he got from fermenting plums, I think they told us. The first day we got there, he pours a couple shots of this, and he toasted to our health or something. He didn't speak English either. Well, I remember glancing over at Mike as we were raising these shot glasses, and then looking back as my eyes are watering and my throat is just on fire. Now, years ago, I had taken a shot of Everclear, and it's essentially pure alcohol. It's pretty harsh, but I'd compare it to this, but I'd say that this stuff was worse. So this drinking of this plum-based turpentine/alcohol was done at least a couple times a day, usually later in the day and evening. And Mike and I quickly got to the point where we'd try to avoid these sessions if possible, but over the next few days, I will say we drank quite a bit of that stuff. The alcohol was bad enough, but it was the fact that our host didn't speak more than a few words of English. So every time there was a pause, which was essentially all the time, out came this bottle. And we would have sucked it up and hung out with him a little bit more if we could have spoken to the guy, because our understanding was he had a really colorful history, and he'd been in World War II, and he'd seen just so much that had happened there during that war in Bosnia. And the first couple of nights in the big German's house, Mike and I, we'd get to bed pretty early because there just wasn't much else to do, and usually our guts weren't real happy with that drinking either. Then later in the evening, we'd be awoken by the sound of gunfire and bullets ricocheting off the street, like right outside of the bedroom window. So the first time this happened, we both dove underneath our beds and were looking at each other like, holy hell, what the hell's going on? And after a short time, the gunfire would stop. Sometimes it'd be done for the night, and sometimes it'd start up again a few hours later. Well, after that first night, we asked the other monitors through interpreters, and we're like, what's that all about? They said, oh, that's essentially just the locals blowing off steam, and it's really not a big deal. Don't worry about it. So we asked the big German the same thing through an interpreter, and he just kind of laughs and says the same thing, don't worry, nobody's going to shoot you in my house. Here, drink some of this. Now, the gunfire became a semi-regular thing, maybe a few nights a week, heavier on the weekends. And after that first week, it got to the point that Mike, after we'd been awoken by the gunfire outside the window, and since he was closest to the window, he'd open it up and in his best loud New Yorker voice, he'd bellow at these guys to stop doing it, but in much more colorful language. Well, that kind of covers the Bosnia experience from the start to getting us into country that first couple of weeks. And as I said, I plan to do at least one and maybe more episodes on just some of the things that I experienced, funny things and sad things and things that I think would be of interest. So with that, I close this episode of I Barely Got Here. I want to thank you for listening, and if you like the show, please subscribe and post a review, and ask your friends to give it a listen as well. If you have a question or you have a comment, you can shoot me an email at ibarelygothere@gmail.com, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Sam42 is 107.